I'm Felicia Wong, President and CEO here at the Roosevelt Institute, and along with the American Prospect and the New Press, I am thrilled to welcome you to our webcast today. Over the next hour, we'll be hearing from two of the progressive movement's greatest thinkers, Bob Kuttner and Heather McGhee. So just a little bit about the two of them. Robert Kuttner is the co-founder and co-editor of the American Prospect and the author of the new book, Going Big, FDR's Legacy, Biden's New Deal, and the Struggle to Save Democracy. Heather McGhee is the board chair for Color of Change and the author of The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. In today's conversation, Bob and Heather will be discussing some of the big questions we think about a lot here at the Roosevelt Institute, like how can we build on FDR's legacy and create a new deal for today's multiracial America? Or how can we create the high care, low carbon economy that we need? And how can we overcome racist institutions and rising authoritarianism to rebalance power and to not just protect our democracy, but to create the democracy that we all deserve? So in the first year plus of the Biden administration, we've seen some pretty big shifts, as Bob writes in his book. Biden has been more pro-public and pro-union than any president in decades. He has explicitly called out racism and prioritized racial inclusion in unprecedented ways. I do think that it's our job to make sure to keep his team accountable to those promises. And it's good because he himself has a policy team that represents some of the best of the new economics. They helped craft the American Rescue Plan that gave us a historic recovery, that created millions of jobs, and that boosted worker power and economic security. His administration has bigger aspirations on climate and on industrial policy than we've seen in my political lifetime. These are things that we need to keep pushing for because, as we all are too aware, Biden has not been able to go as big as often as he'd like, and certainly not as much as we'd like. We have the filibuster. We have the resistance of a few key senators, and these things have so far prevented big ticket items like Build Back Better and voting rights legislation. And the razor thin congressional majorities that Biden has worked within, are unlikely to be preserved this November. But as Bob and Heather will discuss, New Deal style boldness is still what we need. Civil rights era racial justice, updated for the 21st century, is still what we need. Put simply, transforming our economy and making our democracy true to our biggest, most multiracial aspirations. These are things that demand that we go big. So later in the hour, my colleague, Roosevelt Institute Chief of Programs, Marissa Guananja, will facilitate a question and answer with our guests. Feel free to get ready to ask Bob and Heather anything you'd like in the chat, and we'll try to cover as much of that as we can. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bob Kuttner and Heather McGhee.
Thanks so much, Felicia. Welcome, Bob. This is so exciting. We're really excited to have this conversation to celebrate the launch of Going Big. This is a real moment, I think, for this conversation. Thanks so much to the Roosevelt Institute and to the New Press and the American Prospect, three of my favorite organizations in the intellectual ecosystem of the American left. And I just want to say, by way of personal introduction, that I have known Bob Kuttner and had the real honor to have been mentored by Bob Kuttner for most of my actual working career. And I always eagerly await his next book. And so when I got a galley copy of Going Big, I thought, wow, Bob has done it again with incredible insider access to key participants in the Biden administration. a big sweep of history and a laser-like focus on the political economy that is of this moment and that is needed in terms of the changes that we have to see to make sure that American democracy survives. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bob, who's going to talk about going big, which I hope you all get from an independent bookseller or bookshop right now, or the New Press website, and then we'll have a little conversation. So Bob.
Heather, thanks so much. And thanks so much to Felicia. The Roosevelt Institute, of course, is the perfect place to have this discussion. The book's subtitle begins with the words Roosevelt's Legacy, and we are all dependent on Roosevelt's legacy. The book offers a salute to FDR, a critique of the Democrats' years in the neoliberal wilderness that spanned 3 presidencies from Carter to Obama, and a thank you to Joe Biden for putting us back on the progressive path. But that path is precarious. The book's opening lines read, Joe Biden's presidency will either be a historic pivot back to New Deal economics and forward to energized democracy, or a heartbreaking interregnum between 2 bouts of deepening American fascism. And I have to say, the book turned out to be a little more contrarian than I thought it would be when I set out to write it. You could say my timing is impeccable. Yesterday's Times lead political story, quote, the collective mood of Democratic insiders has darkened appreciably in recent weeks. Pollsters and prognosticators are forecasting increasingly dire results in the midterm election. Now, I am trying in this book to be hopeful without being wishful. History can be terribly unjust. If history were just, Biden would have a few more votes in the Senate. He'd be able to enact his latter-day New Deal program. That in turn would reinforce his own standing with the public and create a more just country and more support for progressives. The specific elements of Biden's program are popular, but he is not popular because he looks like a president who can't govern and because he is cursed with random plagues, mostly not of his own making, from COVID to the supply chain crisis and the resulting inflation, which the current war exacerbates. So he doesn't get enough credit for all that he has done well. The book has a few basic points to make. First, Biden was right to go big. The country needed it. His party needed it. If anything, his program needs to be even more radical. He needs to be an even more fervent advocate for working families on pocketbook issues, even if he can't get most of his program enacted anytime soon. The problem isn't Joe Manchin. The problem is the 50 Senate Republicans. When I worked in the Senate in the 1970s for William Proxmire, you could literally get in a car in Washington State and drive east to Pennsylvania and not pass through a single state that had a Republican senator. And better yet, all of the Democratic senators in those states were progressive senators. They were labor Democrats. So we need to take this fight to the Republicans and get them off of the divisive cultural issues and remind voters why Republicans oppose Democrats on pocketbook issues that most people favor. Our role model here is Harry Truman, the one Democrat in living memory, my living memory anyway, whose approval ratings were even lower than Joe Biden's. Truman took the fight to the Republicans. He sent up legislation that he knew Republicans would not pass, popular legislation, New Deal legislation, and then he went on the road to campaign against them. He liked to say, don't vote for me, vote for yourselves. And I would like to see Biden doing more of that. And I think our job as a progressive movement is both to support him when he deserves support, which is often the case, and to hold his feet to the fire when he is being too tepid. Second point, and this is absolutely key, the Democrats' embrace of neoliberalism and their alliance with Wall Street from Carter to Obama, especially Clinton, paved the road for Donald Trump. FDR said in 1936, when he accepted his party's nomination for president for the second time, speaking of bankers, they hate me and I welcome their hatred. In 2009, Obama, speaking to a group of leading bankers, asking them to support his 2-week reform program, He said, "My administration is the only thing standing between you and the pitchforks." This stance allowed the Tea Parties and later Trump to be the instrument of voter dissatisfaction with government and politics, and Democrats to be the target. Obama should have been with the pitchforks. This book also looks at the great scourge of progressivism, racism. FDR made his terrible accommodation with white supremacy in order to get his New Deal enacted. It was a New Deal for white people. Lyndon Johnson's multiracial coalition succumbed to white backlash and the cynicism of Richard Nixon in maneuvering to have Republicans supplant Dixiecrats as the party of white supremacy. Biden has to jockey between legitimate Black demands for radical reforms that are 400 years late and Republican caricatures of critical race theory. On the whole, he has done this well. I especially commend Heather's superb book, The Sum of Us, on racial coalition politics that embrace everyone without downplaying the critical role of race and racism. Much of my book is an appreciation of just how radical Roosevelt was and how long the New Deal's half-life lasted. FDR not only put government on the side of ordinary people with public works and social insurance, he tightly regulated capitalism, especially financial capitalism. He put the state on the side of labor as a counterweight to capital. All of this produced an economy that not only produced high growth rates for 25 years, but an economy that became more equal. And if you think this was just the normal result of a recovery from war, look at the 25 years after World War I. No, it was the result of different rules of capitalism that in turn were the result of a different political coalition. For me personally, Biden's return to New Deal progressivism has been affirming. I've spent my whole life on the left edge of the possible. I co-founded two institutions, the American Prospect and the Economic Policy Institute, whose work is being taken more seriously inside the halls of power than at any time in my lifetime. I appreciate Biden's superb appointees. The book also talks about social movements, and I'm eager to engage with Heather on this question. I think in some sense, the social movements of the 30s that put pressure on Roosevelt and the 60s that put pressure on LBJ were politically more strategic than some of today's social movements. And that may be one of the reasons why Biden is not accomplishing as much as he might. The final point in the book maybe is the most important one. There is a road to defeating Trump and Trumpism and neo-fascism. In the midterms this fall, Donald Trump will be our secret weapon. He's not on the ballot, but his surrogates will be. And in his clumsy effort to play kingmaker, Trump is promoting badly blemished candidates, wrecking Republican Party unity, diverting energy and money to divisive primaries. In Pennsylvania, where Democrats have two possible strong Senate candidates, Trump endorsed a fellow TV showman, shaman with the Dickensian name of Dr. Oz over a stronger mainstream Republican. In Ohio, the Democratic nominee is likely to be the economic populist Tim Ryan. Trump endorsed J.D. Vance, who can't quite decide whether his persona is hillbilly or hedge fund. And you can go on and on and on. Sonny Perdue in Georgia is running well behind Trump's nemesis, the incumbent governor, Brian Kemp. In the Senate contest, his preferred nominee, Herschel Walker, suffers from a fake resume and allegations of sexual assault. And so Democrats actually have a decent chance of holding the Senate. Trump will be figuratively on the ballot in a second sense. The 2022 midterms are a run-up to 2024, and many Democrats may be quiescent for the moment, but the Democratic base is likely to awaken this summer as Democrats are reminded of the peril of a second Trump term. The best comparison is to 2018, when large numbers of liberals and moderates, appalled by Trump's presidency, saw that election as a firebreak. Democrats made net gains of 41 seats in the House, some in long shot contests that were not even on the national party's radar screen. Turnout increased by a record 13.6% over 2014, most of it benefiting Democrats. So a lot will depend on how closely 2022 represents 2018. And my wager is that the ubiquitous lunacy of Donald Trump will remind dispirited Democrats what is at stake. As the election approaches, the panel investigating the attempted coup of January 6th will be reporting, putting Republicans on the spot, whether to be with Trump or against him. Trump and his henchmen will be doubling down on their contention that the 2020 election was stolen when most Republicans want to move on. And if the Supreme Court bans abortion, that will also galvanize progressives. It's also easier to overstate how Republican voter suppression measures undermine Democrats. Most states still run fair elections. I count at least 25 Republican House members who won by less than 10 points in states that still have fair elections. And contrary to earlier projections, redistricting is roughly a partisan wash. Last point, this book is not a love letter to Joe Biden. Biden moved left because neoliberalism was a practical and political failure. He moved left because he was pushed by Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. If they had both not run, one or the other would likely have been the nominee. So weirdly, we have the soul of a Sanders-Warren administration in the persona of Joe Biden. He could be doing a lot more to help himself and his party. Just for starters, instead of doing student debt relief in dribs and drabs, he should be foursquare on that and cancel $50,000 of student debt. That would make him a hero to two generations of young Americans who tend not to vote, but when they do vote, they vote for progressive and Democrats. There's a lot more we can discuss, and I'm thrilled that Heather McGhee is here to discuss it with us.
Marvelous. Thank you so much, Bob. I want to start where you left off with student loan debt cancellation, just very quickly. The politics of that, as I've seen, I've been working on the issue of student debt and higher education affordability for much of my career. I know many of the people in the Department of Education who are, really going to be the ones doing this work. He's moved a lot from really sort of, I think, fitting a little bit with his generation and his experience of what college was, which was something for the rich guys to do, and something that was, a fifth of what it is now, as he was during the campaign when he was sort of dismissive of the idea that the government should cancel student loan debt, to really understanding that it's actually a racial justice issue. The racial wealth divide has meant that more Black and brown students have had to borrow at higher levels, and that this is really one of those ways that the racial wealth divide is being exacerbated. And understanding that most young people who graduate from college, from high school, go on to some college, right? This is no longer an elite project, the idea of college, particularly not when working class wages are so low. But the fear has always been that there will be a backlash, that our zero-sum narrative that says we don't want anything good for anybody else, the sort of racial resentment that Fox will turn this into some sort of reparations, and has plenty of Democrats talking about the racial aspect of this to use that. And so how would you counsel the White House at this moment, who looks like it's moving closer, right? We had that report of Biden speaking to the Congressional Hispanic Caucus on this, to do it in a way where it really gets the biggest dividend politically?
I think you have to look at who takes out student loans. And these are kids without rich parents to pay tuition, almost by definition. Mm-hmm. So it's upwardly mobile, working class, lower middle class, Black and brown students who are often the first members of their family to go to college. And then before their economic lives even get started, you saddle them with debt that now averages $37,000 per debtor. And we're talking about over 40 million people. Yeah. And contrary to the economics of Larry Summers and others who make two arguments, both of which are wrong. The first argument is that we shouldn't do this because the average college graduate makes more than the average non-college graduate. Well, if you unpack that, the average college graduate, and the Department of Education has statistics on this, the average college graduate who took out loans to go to college is not from a rich family. Mm-hmm. Secondly, and I've run the numbers on this, the effect on inflation would be trivial. The fact that some of people talking to Biden are saying that, well, this will spike inflation. First of all, for 18 months, we've had debt pauses. So it's not like if you have permanent debt cancellation, debtors are going to treat this as a windfall and go out and spend the money, because for a year and a half, they have been spared those payments. The only question is whether to make the relief permanent instead of doling it out in ways that don't get any headlines. And I think politically, this would make Biden such a hero, legitimately, for people who desperately need relief, who tend to be skeptical of politics, cynical about politicians. You know this better than I do, Heather. If 40 years ago, someone had said, hey, here's an idea, let's have a program where by the year 2022, we saddled 2.5 generations of Americans with $1.7 trillion of debt. How about that? No politician would have embraced that. But we backed into it. And it's time for someone to exercise leadership and cut the damn knot. And Joe Biden is in a position to do that and get credit for doing it.
Great. So you raise inflation, which I think is a really important topic. Someone mentioned it in the chat, and it was on my list of questions for you. When we look at, what do you think is the current dominant narrative on inflation, and what does Biden need it to be to get more credit, A, for how he has gone big, and to deflect blame for what is the most salient economic issue in most people's day-to-day lives?
It's a great question and a difficult challenge for Biden. So the dominant narrative is prices are going up and I don't like it. And President Biden is the incumbent, so it must be his fault. And this is typically what happens. If something occurs that is harmful to ordinary people, the administration in power gets the blame. I think Biden could be even more emphatic on the supply chain catastrophe, which was the result of corporate globalist policies and naive assumptions about just-in-time production and the over-reliance on China. That's the cause of the preponderance of inflation. The second biggest cause of inflation is corporate price gouging. People don't like that. Biden could get out in front of that. For example, airline fares have gone up 40% in the first 4 months of this year. Only 10% of that price increase is the result of more expensive aviation fuel. There was a presentation to investors and to Wall Street stock analysts by CEOs of airlines who were bragging about the fact that they were withholding increased capacity so they could raise fares. Now, the FTC, the DOT, Department of Transportation, and the Antitrust Division of the Justice Department have a lot of broad authority to go after airline price gouging and monopoly concentration, even with airline deregulation, the gift of Jimmy Carter. DOT still has a lot of residual authority. I'm going to be writing about this, that they could use both to ameliorate this, but also to demonstrate to the public which side this administration is on. We need to be with the pitchforks. And I think Biden gets advice, from two kinds of advisors, from advisors who want him to be more populist. Some of our friends who went into the administration, I think they're right. And advisors who want him to temporize. And I think they're wrong, because that produces a muddled message and a feebled politics.
So to that point about the sort of two kind of advisors, I was in a conversation with a very high level organizer the other day, and they were making the point that for their base, which includes hundreds of thousands of super activists across the country, there is a real confusion about the Democratic brand right now, and about the answer to why hasn't this trifecta, right? So the plan, in 2016, when we had millions of people doing more than they'd ever done in politics before, was defeat Trump, pass a trifecta, gain a trifecta of democratic control, and then pass these structural reforms, right, to the economy and our democracy. And two things have happened, and the third didn't quite happen. And the why is a big question as we rely on activists to propel a movement forward. And I've been observing that, it's very clear, right, that Manchin, to some degree, Sinema have, although they are Democrats, stopped this super popular Democratic agenda in its tracks, right? Betrayed the deal on having a bipartisan infrastructure plan vote and the BBB vote, just walked away from that idea altogether. And that, there was an unelected Senate parliamentarian who basically stopped us from winning $15 an hour at the beginning of the administration. And so the question is, this organizer was saying there are kind of two types of Democrats, and it's maybe not so much moderate versus progressive, but rather people who are fighters and people who are normalists, or people who are, ambitious and courageous, and people who are more careerist or status quo. And that's something like there might be some frontline, folks who are more moderate, but actually aren't as, but are willing to sort of take up the fight, right, on things like prescription drug costs and stuff like that. So I'm just wondering, how do you think that the White House and others should be communicating the theory of the case of why we didn't go big, what it means to be a Democrat, and are there still some fights left on the field before November?
Yeah, there are lots of fights. For instance, and again, I want to reiterate the point that the problem is not Manchin and Sinema. The problem is 50 Republicans. And the truest thing Manchin ever said, maybe the only true thing he ever said, was if you want more progressive legislation, you got to elect more liberals. And so Biden should be out there saying, if you want us to make the child tax credit permanent, elect more Democrats. There have always been conservative Democrats who made it hard for Democrats to be progressive. They were racial conservatives. They were economic conservatives. They were racial reactionaries. Roosevelt had to contend with them. Johnson had to contend with them. But the way to have a working progressive majority is to elect a few more Democrats. And so if you go out there and strongly make the case for programs that are popular, like the universal child tax credit, or if you use executive power not just to cancel student debt, but to reduce drug prices, and while you're at it, whack the drug companies, who are one of the most unpopular industries there is with ordinary people. You put yourself on the side of ordinary people. You explain that what is standing between me, Joe Biden, and my ability to deliver is the lack of a few more Democrats in Congress, and you go out and fight for it. I mean, he should be sentenced to go back and read about Truman's campaign of 1948. It's possible to do that even when you don't have a working majority in Congress. That's how you get a working majority in Congress.
So it's running on you in these key sort of purple or reddish states. Give me more Democrats and I'll give you the New Deal.
Yeah, and I think all this defeatist talk about what kind of a blowout the Democrats are going to suffer in 2022 makes Biden more inclined to temporize. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. I mean, there are no swing voters hardly, but there are lots of swing districts, and which way they swing depends on turnout. And so with Stacey Abrams as our role model, we need to go back and do, and we as the whole progressive movement, what we did beginning with the women's marches of 2017 and the efforts by Indivisible and lots of other groups. We need to get organized. We do not have the luxury of despair. We do not have the luxury of disillusionment. And whether we hold on to Congress and prevent much worse neo-fascism from happening. I mean, the Republicans are already salivating about the kind of impositions they can subject the executive branch to if they take back the House. we have to remember what the stakes are. And I think the more Donald Trump is in evidence this summer, the more Democrats are primed to be reminded of the stakes. And that's what organizers have to do. And 2022 has to be like 2018. Otherwise, we really are toast. And I don't
I
think
hope
we should
that's
have it.
not the case, because every organizer I talk to has no hope that we can recreate the energy of 2018. Trump is not in the office. Everything they feel was left on the field for 2020, and it feels like to them that Democrats actually defeated, the agenda that they worked so hard for. So that, I think, is the challenge.
Well,
Yeah, go ahead.
Democrats didn't defeat the agenda they worked so hard for. Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema defeated the agenda. So this goes to your earlier point about the confusion of what the Democratic brand is. The Democratic brand today is a progressive brand, and Manchin and Sinema are complete outliers, and we mustn't let them paralyze the party. Now, organizers, above all people, should not give up hope. They've got to be the role models. They've got to persuade other people that all is not lost.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think they're not hopeful, but I do think they're very worried about this core question of how do you get people to be as excited for the Democratic Party as they were in 2020. One last question before we turn it over to Marissa and get the audience questions in here, which I'm really looking forward to. What surprised you? What was the most surprising thing for you in the research for the book and the conversations that you had?
I think the most surprising thing in the research for the book and the events of the past year and a half was what a progressive Joe Biden turned out to be. And it's a really interesting question to explore. I spent some time in the book doing that. I mean, it's one part, as I said, the influence of Warren, who very astutely traded loyalty early on for influence. And so a lot of the Biden program is really a Warren program. A lot of the best staffers are staffers who were either part of Warren World or were commended by Warren World. And I think the political and practical failure of neoliberalism, all of this came together to push Biden into being a much more progressive president than most of us feared. And that's just fantastic. You don't get that kind of outcome every day. And I think that was a good surprise. And I think the bad surprise was that all of the luck that Biden enjoyed from the time he got nominated, much against everybody's predictions, right through maybe August or September of last year, and then luck just deserted him. And it really is the injustice of history. And maybe some of that luck can come back. Maybe inflation will start subsiding. Maybe this horrible war will be over. Maybe COVID will start winding down. And to some extent, Biden is a captive of which way things break. But as John Kennedy liked to say, you make your luck. And all of those organizers who are feeling despondent, we all have to make our luck.
Great. All right. So I am going to call in Marissa, who's the Chief Programs Officer for the Roosevelt Institute, where she oversees the organization's programmatic activities. And she is going to run through the questions for us. Thanks, Marissa.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Heather. Thanks, Bob. So again, my name is Marissa Guanaja, Chief Programs Officer at Roosevelt, and I'll be leading us through the Q&A portion of our time together and moderating some of the audience questions. And I did just want to say that as a C3, we're really excited about the big ideas that we're elevating here in this conversation, and not endorsing any particular candidates, but again, the big ideas that are fomenting from this are really exciting. Just a quick reminder to our audience that we'll be using our chat function. So if you do have questions that you haven't gotten into the queue, please use the chat function to get your questions in. Don't use a Q&A or raise your hand. Feel free to drop your questions into that chat along with your name and affiliation. And with that, I'll get us started. Actually, the first question I have is from Chip Pitts, and I'm going to direct it to both of you, Heather and Bob, which is, how big is the potential of mobilizing against the threat to democracy versus merely emphasizing the pocketbook economic issues that folks are facing?
Well, it's a very good question. I think it's both and. I think if you mobilize around the pocketbook issues, that will bring out one set of voters who might be sitting on their hands. And obviously, Trump being ubiquitous in his craziness will remind people of the threat to democracy. And it's the job of Democrats to help remind them. So I hope to pull people out to vote based on both issues.
Yeah, that's a great answer. The only quick thing I would add is that I think what we have learned is that democracy is not an end unto itself for most people, right? It's about what do you get from being in a democracy, right? It's a certain quality of life, a certain sense of fairness, a certain sort of civic pride, right? So all of that, the sort of what is robbed from you when your democracy is corrupt, right? Is you have poisoned air and water. You have high prices. You have high levels of student loan debt. You have predatory lenders, right? So it's about what happens when your democracy is not there, when you don't have a voice. And so ultimately, what we've learned is that you have to speak not just to a patriotic idea, but rather to something that's more core in people's need, that sense of what their needs are as human beings. That said, I think it is very difficult to ask people when the Democrats have a trifecta to organize for something else. That the sort of just obvious logic is, well, Biden's the president, why isn't he giving it to us now? And so fear of what could be with a change is a little bit easier to communicate than hope for what should be with a slight change and improvement over what already was supposed to have been a win, right?
Great.
I think you both touched on this a little bit in your conversation, but the current administration's program of public investment and social supports in response to the pandemic has achieved real material benefits for people that have really often been left out of real material benefit of government programs, wage growth, job growth. And yet we find ourselves unable to break through. The message is not getting through. I think you could blame part of that on inflation, but and on that being sort of the dominant narrative right now. But is there more to your diagnosis of why we haven't been able to break through despite the material equity that people are really starting to feel right now? And again, I think that's for both of you in terms of your thoughts there.
Well, I think it's one part, as you say, as the questioner says, it gets crowded out by the bad news. Biden helped create all these jobs. It's a record recovery from a recession. But right now, I'm worried about inflation. Right now, I'm worried about COVID. And that's what's uppermost in people's minds. The other problem is that if you compare the original New Deal with Biden's recovery program, the original New Deal was mostly federal programs. They were direct federal programs. So if you benefited from the WPA, there it was, WPA, a federal program. Mm-hmm. Whereas the infrastructure money, a lot of the recovery money, it goes through the states. You have Republicans who voted against the thing taking credit for the money that they're bringing in to their districts. And again, Biden and members of his cabinet could be more proactive as some of these community infrastructure investments roll out. He could be out there reminding the voters where this came from.
Really great points, both. Yes, I mean, I think there's a question that needs to be called on progressives' reliance on a federalist structure for benefits just period, right? Because we know that not only is it not as powerful in terms of, branding, as it were, but it also means that oftentimes people in red states are going to miss out, right? And that's not, the majority of Black people live in southern states, for example, right? So this is a significant problem. I will just also add that we have an attention problem and a narrative infrastructure problem, right? The majority of what is spoken about through our various media is not our message, right? And the thing that made Donald Trump president was not him being a rich guy or a great guy giving speeches, was him being on reality television and in people's living rooms for a decade. Thank you, NBC, right? And really understanding the power of attention, and I think that is a problem that the entire ecosystem needs to contend with, because Democrats like slip around in their message all the time. Like, what is our story about inflation? Too many things, not enough things, right? But then also, even if we were saying exactly all the same thing, it's not clear that it would become common sense for most Americans. And that's a really significant problem with disinformation, misinformation, the right wing takeover of social media, the plutocrats takeover of social media, and the sort of the strong clarity that the right wing has in their story that they're telling.
I would also just add to that Republicans seem to have more message discipline and more movement discipline. And because we are Democrats and we are progressives, the famous Will Rogers line, we tend to be more anarchic. So the plus and the minus of the environmental movement, climate justice movement, the movement for Black lives, the Occupy Wall Street movement, is that everybody was free to define it their own way. And you compare that with the 1960s, where at least in 62, 3, 4, and 5, the movement groups, Dr. King and the other movement people on the ground, could meet with Johnson and they could bargain with Johnson. And there was leadership and there was movement discipline. And in the same way, even though the labor movement of the 30s had a lot of different facets, had communists, socialists, radicals, not so radicals, the leadership of that movement could meet with Roosevelt and bargain with Roosevelt. We don't have that kind of relationship today, it seems to me, between movement leaders and party leaders, because our movement, God bless it, is more diffuse, which is a strength and a weakness.
Is that part of what you referenced in your conversation earlier, that the important role of social movements, and that their previous and the need for a political strategy in social movements? So is that what you're referring to in terms of when you were offering that critique of social movements today, the diffuse nature of it?
It wasn't a critique of them, it's just an observation that the nature of today's social movements are somewhat less disciplined and coherent than strategically coherent than the great social movements of the past. I just lay it out as a dilemma.
Oh no, there we go.
Right. Are we still there? I think I froze or someone froze. Barbara, are you still there with us?
I'm here. Yep.
Okay, great. Okay. I wanted to bring in another audience question here. Should progressives be more direct in calling out conservative dog whistles and blatant racism? Again, this is for both of you.
Yeah, sure. I'll take this one first. We absolutely have to, but we have to do it in a way that is not about virtue signaling, but rather is about persuasion, right? Politics is persuasion, it's persuasion, it's persuasion, right? And I think that there's been both at the same time, there's just a little bit too much confidence within the kind of liberal elite, I'll say that just in quotes, that Americans don't hold these racist views, right? And by Americans, I mean many Americans and not just white Americans, right? So if we really know the stakes of how powerful the dog whistles are, of how prominent and pervasive the zero-sum racial view, right? That we are in a competition for spoils and they are given out by racial and ethnic groups. And if one group gets more, then the other groups get less. That is America's oldest story, right? And so if we are sober about how pervasive that is, then I think we can be more disciplined about the need to, even when we are talking to our base and people of color and young people, be very clear that we are always persuading, right? We need to always be in the business of persuasion around the fundamental equality and dignity of every human being, because nothing else in our society communicates that this country actually believes in the fundamental equality and dignity of every human being. The sort of meta message of American life is inequality, right? Is if you are at the bottom of a ladder of human value, you are destined for poverty and it's your fault, right? That's what is communicated without a political message. That's what's just communicated by our neighborhoods, right? In our life. And so we really need to be sort of ingrained in that and not take any shortcuts when communicating about race and racism. And so that's why I think we absolutely have to do it all the time. I think it makes zero sense for us to have an economic populism message that isn't one that calls out how racism is a weapon of that corporate class and how greed is perpetuated by racism and divide and conquer politics. And it also means that we have to not be afraid. Every time I've talked to political leaders in Washington over the past 9 months, they've asked a question about critical race theory and how they should respond. And the message that they are getting from whoever actually is influential with them is basically not to respond because they're scared of it. And Americans of all backgrounds don't want banned books. 88% of the country believes that we have to teach the best of our history and the worst of our history. The idea that our children's freedom to learn should be something that is sacred and that you shouldn't trust anybody who's trying to keep ideas and truth from you, right? It's all very strong moral, it's moral high ground to stand on. And yet Democrats' sort of shyness around these issues has meant that we've muddled the moral waters and we've seemed to abandon a movement broadly that was, plurality, if not a majority, white, that came into racial consciousness and awareness in 2020. We seem to be now abandoning it by not fighting to keep Beloved, the best novel that has ever been written in the United States, on the bookshelves in American high schools, right? These should be easy fights.
And I would just add one thing, and I agree with everything Heather says. When you say what Heather just articulated better than I can about book banning or about Beloved, you can also say, and by the way, if we ban Beloved, what exactly is that going to do to help you put bread on the table? And look at all the things that the people who want to ban Beloved are not doing to help you put bread on the table. And look at what they are resisting that Democrats want to enact that would help improve your condition. So it's absolutely both and. That's the brilliance of Heather's book. And it's the economic coalition without sacrificing the special work that we have to do on racial justice.
That's right.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. There's been a lot of questions around student debt, and I'm going to try to sort of collapse them a little bit here. But on the issue of student debt forgiveness, how do you contend with the complaint that once you forgive current student debt, there will be more in the future? The additional, I would say, let's call it critique, that you can forgive student debt, but it will do very little to actually close the racial wealth gap that we see. So just any comments on sort of the,
Yeah, I would say three things very briefly. One, I would never use the term forgiveness because it makes it sound like somebody's done something wrong, right? And so that's why I think cancellation has been the right word. It's like a contract, a bad contract, and it's being canceled. Like you can get out of a cell phone contract and move on to a different carrier, right? I absolutely think in an ideal world, we would have debt-free college, which means refilling the pool of public goods of funding our public colleges, and having debt cancellation. Right, one can be done. Thank you, Elizabeth Warren, for figuring that out for us through executive power, and the other needs Congress. Right, so it would be great to have both. But there have been a lot of states that have moved on the free community college idea that first was proposed in the Obama administration. So we are getting closer, and the college funding is going in the right direction at the state level for the first time in a very long time. And then third, so there's two pieces, right? There's the racial wealth gap, which is basically, a story of two things, right? How much wealth white people have and how little wealth black people have. When it comes to this generation of people who have some college and either some college or an actual college degree, black households would absolutely be better off if they didn't have, in the high teens of student loan debt service, which for black households, black borrowers, is growing, not shrinking, right? People 10 years out owe more than they borrow, right? So I don't think we can say that it won't be a wealth benefit to get these families out of the red, and to allow people to spend $500 a month investing in their future instead of paying off their past. But yes, many white people, right? 6 out of 10 white students have to borrow to go to college, right? So will the gap narrow? Not necessarily. It won't be as significant about the racial divide, but it will get families who need to be out from underwater, out from underwater. And that's a big deal.
Well, and it will put black and white student debtors in the same boat and remind them of their commonality. And there are obviously other things that need to be done to narrow the racial wealth gap. Just on the point about you don't want to start the debt clock ticking all over again. We need to go back to what we had until about 35 years ago, whereby public universities really are public universities, the same way public schools are public schools, meaning you don't have to pay out of pocket to attend them. And there are a number of ways of doing that. Sanders has a pretty good bill where the feds pick up a lot of the cost, but in order to get the feds to pick up the cost, a state legislature has to commit to fund some large percentage of total cost of public state universities the way it used to before this was shifted onto tuition. You could also, in order to make it somewhat income contingent, you could take a better version of the FAFSA, the application that you file to determine how much student aid you need, you're entitled to. And instead of giving you an entitlement to borrow, that could be a grant. So there are lots of ways of canceling student debt and then not rebuilding it all over again. And I think it was Demos, when you were president of Demos, Heather, that talked about ending the debt for diploma system. And we have to do that.
Both. I think we've got, want to wrap up with some closing thoughts that you might have. What gives you hope for the future? If you where are you finding hope? And as we sign off here, Bob, I'll turn it to you to send us off here. And then Heather, if you want to add any other closing thoughts, please do. Okay, we're good. Okay.
No, I am finding hope in the fact that despair just is not an option. Going down the road of neo-fascism is just too horrible to contemplate. And even though you can paint just a dreadful picture of how the Democrats are doomed this fall, I think it's just incumbent upon us to keep hope alive, to be strategic rather than wishful, to remind organizers that there have been tougher times than this. If you think this is tough, look at what's like to be a Ukrainian. And just let's don't mourn. Let's organize. And there's a favorite line that many of you know by Antonio Gramsci that I choose to translate a little differently. Gramsci talked about pessimism of the mind, pessimism based on what you know, and optimism of the will, optimism based on what you know you need to do. I like to translate that as pessimism of the mind, optimism of the heart, and we need that now more than we have ever needed it. So
Thank
buy
you.
the book. That's the other hopeful thing I can
I was
say.
about to say.
That's
Bob,
what I was gonna say.
yeah, Bob, thank you. That was amazing. And yes, buy the book. Going
Buy
big,
both books. Buy Heather's book too.
and the Some of
Speaking
Us.
of keeping hope alive.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you all. Thank you to the American Prospect, to the New Press, for partnering with us and bringing this conversation to you all. And be on the lookout for more conversations from the Roosevelt Institute as well. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Take care, everybody. Take care of yourselves. Take care of each other.